background to the age of revolutions. And sometimes, well, actually, on this, I'm going to focus on the Atlantic revolutions, but overall, I'm calling this unit the age of revolutions. And just a reminder that the definition of revolution, in the original thought, it had the idea of to circle or orbit. We talk about a revolution of the Earth around the sun is a year and things like that. For this class, we're defining it as radical change and often violent change, so that we can kind of understand the ideas of like industrial revolution versus some of the ones we're talking about now. So these are the violent revolutions. We really want to ask this question here: where are we in world history, and what's the context? What's going on? So that's really the purpose of this, is to figure out those two questions. A brave new world. So, as we all know, hopefully in 1492, Columbus sets sail and discovers the New World, as it's called. It's North and South America. That's what we call it today. This fires off the Columbian Exchange, and it's a massive interchange of these new goods. In some ways, that's plants, animals. It can also be, spices. It can be resources. Like gold and silver and things like that, and also diseases, which is going to really decimate the population of the New World, the indigenous or Indian population. So it does bring a lot of change. For example, horses go to the New World, and that's what we think of as we think about the North American. Native American is riding around on a horse. They didn't have those until after 1492, early 1500s is when they finally get those. Also happening, we've talked about this in class, is that Portugal and soon others like Spain and the Netherlands are headed out into the Indian Ocean, and they're bringing back trade goods as well. So these improvements in navigation and ships are really bringing back a lot of resources to the New World. It's also, in many ways, helping out the places that they're discovering, but mostly it's helping out the European countries. And so many East India companies are started. There's a British East India Company, Dutch East India Company, and so forth. And so these are really their main goal is to do this trade and to do it as best and as often as heavy-handed as possible. And that's done under the kind of large banner of what I call mercantilism. Now, I'm going to give you the simplified definition. A mother country sets up colonies around the world to make the mother country rich. They are like extraction points, and then everything's being fed back into the mother country. There is like some strict definitions of mercantilism where you're trying to stockpile gold bullion or the actual refined gold bars in your country, and so you want more of that coming in than going out. But in general, you want more imports to the mother country than exports. You want to be hoarding money and hoarding resources. And so those East India companies become really a true example of that. They're set up around the world. They're quasi-government corporations, and by quasi I mean like half government corporations. And in many places in the world, they rule on behalf of Britain, or they rule on behalf of the Netherlands. And so they even control parts of the population, and they're not just seen as, oh, there's the Dutch East India Company. It's like there's the country of Holland or of the Netherlands out having influence in the world. That is the government in many ways. But as time goes on, and depending on the location, the more hospitable places, of course, hey, we can live here. Let's send people to live here. So outposts and trading forts and things like that are not enough. Colonialism is needed. And so this is when settlers from many of the great powers, England, France, Spain, Portugal does colonize Brazil, but they're not as heavily involved in the colonization movement as the other three countries. And so these people head out, to make the mother country famous and great, and they settle in a new place. Also, it's really good for them, the settlers, if they can survive the harsh conditions. They can get more freedom and more access to the possibility of wealth than they could in the kind of old social hierarchy of Europe. These aren't new countries. their colonies are extension of the mother country. And back, just like I was talking previously with the East India companies, when they're setting up these towns around the world, they are seen as little Englands and little Frances and little Spains. That's who they let rule, and that's who has all the power in these places. And they are ultimately loyal to their mother country, whichever one that may be. And just like the old trading posts or outposts were important to, to have people bring in spices or gold or certain kinds of wood, herbs, those kinds of things. These places become an extraction of resources. And so they're like organizing that, and the ships pull up to this new trading. Remember, most of these in the beginning are on coasts, and so mouths of rivers and really good bays and things like that. And so the ship from the mother country sails in, and they load it as fast as they can, and then send it back to the mother country with all these raw materials on board. Over time, though, plantations, which are large farms, usually ruled by someone from the mother country, a colonist, establish key cash crops which are in demand around the world. And I'm just going to go through the list here. Rice, you know what that is. Indigo is a dye. It was used in the original days to make blue jeans blue. So if you think about what the rough color of a blue jean is, that's indigo. Very, very lucrative product in the early days. Tobacco in the early 1600s just really explodes. It begins to be smoked around the world, or in a lot of places they would just put it in their mouth, kind of like the fine pieces of the leaves as snuff, or even snort it. And so tobacco becomes high in demand. Really, one of the key ones is sugar cane. People love sugar, and so sugar cane, as they found out in the New World, it would grow really well in the Caribbean islands. It would grow on the mainlands of Mexico and many places in South America, and then North America as well. And so sugar cane really exploded, and then that's refined down into a couple products. One is sugar, like the sugar that you go buy at the store today, but also a thick syrupy thing called molasses. And a byproduct, or something you could do with molasses, was make rum. So it was like good for everybody, from people who wanted the alcohol to people who had sweet tooths. Cotton it's in the beginning it's less as important, but by around the year 1800, as these revolutions are firing off, large cotton plantations are enabled by the cotton gin. Coffee begins to be established, and rubber as well. These last three come in later, more in the 1800s than they did in the 1700s. So there needs to be a labor force for these plantations. They try to use, in many places, indigenous people, but I've talked about this before. That becomes a problem if you go capture people from a local tribe. They have friends and family living nearby, and as soon as they run away, they are kind of disappeared. They know the trails, they know where to go, and they go deeper into the forest, or just go far, far away, and the labor force disappears. Also, in North and South America, there had been these massive pandemics of smallpox and other diseases, and the population just wasn't there to exploit. So Africa had been exposed to smallpox, and people would go down there starting in the early 1400s, but really kicking up in the 15 and 1600s, and the African tribes would kidnap other people from other tribes and then sell them on the trading ports, the slave ports, to the European slavers, and then they would head with those slaves to the New World. So that kicks into high gear. It winds up being the main labor force of many of these plantations are African kidnapped enslaved peoples. This is the map of the world empires in 1754. So you can see that large parts of North and South America are yellow for Spain. Portugal, like I said, does a little bit on the two coasts of Africa, but mainly Brazil. There's a little bit in India as well. They're green. And then you can see the red, which is just going to explode in the coming years as the United Kingdom expands its influence in North America, but especially India and places like that. By the late 1800s, they have a massive worldwide empire. And then France, which is the dark blue, you could probably, like I've seen a lot of maps that like cover most of North America here. And so by 1754, everybody's vying for land around the world. This is then we kind of have to go back and remind ourselves of the Enlightenment and some key ideas that are being done. Liberty is really focused on freedom, equality, and I want to say, well, some equality for certain people. So, for example, slavery was a big deal in those days, and they looked down on people who weren't Christian, who weren't of the same skin color as them, saw them as savages, things like that. Women were not going to get equal treatment as well, but more we're talking about white men and whether you're rich or poor, educated or uneducated, there would be some level of equality for you. Adam Smith writes a famous book where he argues that free trade and people's kind of self-interest in pursuing trade it actually benefits everyone in the country. So trade between nations and between people within a nation is really looked at as a good thing as we come out of the mercantilism age. Religious tolerance, and I want to say, well, some tolerance. There's still wars going on between, say, Catholics and Protestants all over the world, and people aren't looking at Jewish and Muslim as like equal, but hey, there's some level of if you're Baptist or if you're Methodist or Lutheran, we're going to tolerate you. The big one is republicanism and popular sovereignty. Republicanism is you will have representatives, basically. You give your power to someone. And then popular sovereignty, and I thought I put in this slide, of the people, by the people, for the people. It's government that is people-focused and wants the best for the people. And then we talked about this coming out of the scientific revolution, influencing the Enlightenment, is that you can kind of figure things out. You can think logically and rationally and understand things. Declining in the world is the power of the church. So beginning with the Protestant Reformation, the power of the Catholic Church and its hold on people's lives, also eroded by the Black Death, is waning in new ways. The idea of the absolute monarch and that one person is imbued by God with great power, that's collapsing. The idea of a constitutional monarchy is rising. Britain has that to some level. The monarch still has quite a bit of power in England at this time. But that's going to be an idea that people are going to pursue. And then aristocracy and special privileges, those giving people who are rich and powerful special privileges is seen as declining. And then lastly, what really starts this all off is the thing called the 7 Years' War. It starts off in the American colonies. George Washington's actually involved in the start of this war. It's basically France and England and all their allies versus each other. It starts off in the American colonies, but doesn't stay just there. Many historians call it the First World War, the First Global War. It's fought on several different continents by France and England and then their colonies. So you've got colonies attacking each other, other allies coming in. In the end, Britain wins, but in this case, it's not really winning. They have massive war debts are created for Britain and for France, and they're very difficult for them to handle. They're going to put taxes on people, and so the 7 Years' War is really the powder keg that sets off, especially the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And then in the course of this, we'll be talking more in depth about those two revolutions, which I've listed here, the Haitian Revolution, and then various Latin American revolutions.